Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring Robert Greene's The Laws of Human Nature.
Yeah.
It's a book that really gets you thinking about, well, the hidden forces that drive our actions.
Yeah.
Ever catch yourself doing something and think, wait, what was I even thinking?
All the time.
Greene would say those moments aren't just flukes.
Right.
They're actually glimpses into, like, this primal, irrational side of ourselves that we don't always want to admit exists.
It's true. And what's fascinating is Greene doesn't just stop at like surface level pop psychology. He really goes deep. He draws on all these thinkers from history, like Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, even Freud, to try and make sense of these patterns in human behavior.
So it's not just like, oh, here's some fun facts about
Oh,
psychology.
no, no, no.
He's giving us a framework, like a code book almost,
Exactly.
to decode, like, why people do what they do.
And not just other people, but ourselves, too. It's about self-awareness as much as it is about understanding others.
Okay, so even though we're all living in this, modern tech-savvy world, Greene's saying we're still running on some pretty ancient software.
Oh, absolutely.
And if we don't figure out how that software works, we're kind of doomed to repeat the same mistakes. I mean, just look at social media trends or how people get caught up in those financial bubbles.
Right. It's like we're programmed to just keep making the same errors in judgment over and over again. Greene argues that we have to acknowledge this less rational side of ourselves if we want to break free from those cycles. The book is packed with stories of people making the same bad financial decisions or ending up in toxic relationships. And the crazy thing is, it's not just like people who aren't intelligent. This happens to everyone.
It's almost like there's this invisible force pulling the strings.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And this brings us to one of the coolest parts of the book.
Yeah.
Greene actually gives us tools to, like, see through these forces,
Hmm.
to kind of decode them. He spends a lot of time talking about this concept of the shadow,
Ooh, yes, the shadow.
which is basically that part of ourselves that we keep hidden, the stuff we don't want to admit, maybe even to ourselves.
And understanding that shadow is, I think, one of the most crucial things we can do, not to become cynical or judgmental,
Right.
but to protect ourselves. Because
Yeah.
let's be real, toxic people, they don't exactly come with a warning label.
No, they don't.
In fact, a lot of times they're incredibly charming, which makes them even more dangerous.
Oh, totally. It's like that saying, beware the person who's always smiling. They're probably selling something.
Exactly. And Greene gives some really vivid examples of this in the book. Like he talks about the classic aggressive type, they use their charisma to kind of lull you into a false sense of security and then bam, hit you with their bad behavior when you least expect it.
It's like they get you off guard.
Totally. And he also talks about those moments where we do things that seem out of character,
Yeah.
And his argument is that those moments are actually more revealing of our true nature than we'd like to believe.
So it's like we're not always who we pretend to be.
Not always, no.
And this brings us to another big idea that Greene keeps coming back to, and that's the danger of what he calls grandiosity, or to put it simply, an inflated ego,
Right.
which, let's face it, I think we all struggle with that to some extent, right?
Yeah.
We all have moments where we want to be the best.
Oh, absolutely. We
Wow.
all have that drive within us. And it's actually fascinating because Greene gives this kind of psychological origin story for where that comes from. He talks about the feeling we all had as babies.
Oh. Okay.
That feeling of omnipotence, like we were the center of the universe.
Yeah, yeah.
And as we grow up, we kind of spend our whole lives trying to recapture that feeling, even though ultimately it's an illusion.
It's like we're all on this quest to, like, reclaim our lost kingdom or something.
That's a great way to put it.
And Greene argues that, in a way, modern life kind of makes this whole grandiosity thing even worse, with social media and the pressure to constantly be achieving and this idea that bigger is always better.
Oh, definitely. He uses the story of Michael Eisner and the decline of Disney as a cautionary tale.
Okay.
Most people, they're familiar with the Disney brand, so it makes it even more impactful.
Yeah.
And it really shows how even someone who achieved massive success can still fall into this trap of ego. And it all ties back to, that irrationality we were talking about earlier.
Right, right. So, okay, here's the big question then. If we're all, to some extent, playing this influence game, how do we do it well? And I know Greene actually dedicates a whole section to this. And some of his advice is pretty surprising.
It is. It is. One of the most counterintuitive things he says is that true influence, it's not about overpowering people or forcing them to see things your way.
No.
It's actually about validating their self-opinions. It's
Like
about
kind of,
making them feel seen and heard and understood.
I love that.
Yeah.
He's like that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Exactly. And Greene argues that when you validate someone's self-opinion, it creates this opening, for real influence. He breaks it down into these three potential outcomes. So you can challenge someone's opinion, you can stay neutral, or you can validate it.
Okay.
And he gives all these great examples of each approach, which is really helpful for understanding how this actually works in real life.
Yeah, and one of the examples that really stuck with me was when he talked about honesty mongers.
Hmm.
Those people who are always claiming that they're like, oh, I don't want to influence anyone.
Right, right, right.
But Greene calls BS on that.
Oh,
He
yeah.
says their approach actually backfires a lot of the time and ends up making people resentful.
Because we're all influencing each other all the time,
Yeah.
whether we realize it or not.
So it's like, just own it.
Own it.
Right.
And that actually connects to another recurring theme in the book, which is the power of group dynamics. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as independent, rational thinkers,
Right.
but Greene makes a very strong case that when we're part of a group, our behavior changes dramatically. And he uses some pretty vivid imagery to drive that point home. He talks about how groups can function almost like, packs of animals,
Right.
even using primal imagery to kind of get that across.
He also brings up that story of the Chinese Cultural Revolution,
Yes.
and how easily people, even those who might have been skeptical at first, get swept up in that groupthink. It's pretty chilling.
It is. It is. And then there's the example of court dynamics,
Yeah.
courtiers, gatekeepers, all those kind of power plays that go on behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah.
That one's super relatable, even if you're not in a literal court setting. Because let's be honest, every workplace, every friend group, even every family's got its own version of this.
Oh, totally. And all this kind of leads to one of the most, I think, empowering messages in the book,
Mm-hmm.
which is that we can break free from these often unconscious patterns. But the key, according to Greene, is finding our true purpose.
Yes, and this is where he makes that crucial distinction between real purpose, which comes from within, it drives you forward, and then there's false purpose, which is all about external validation and tends to be pretty fleeting.
I think that resonates with so many people because in a world that's constantly telling us who to be and what to do, it can be really hard to figure out what truly matters to us.
It really can. Greene shares some incredible stories of people who found their calling even in the face of adversity. He talks about Anton Chekhov, who managed to turn his childhood trauma into fuel for his creative work. And then there's Flannery O'Connor, who used her chronic illness to deepen her writing and her faith.
It's like they took those difficult experiences and used them to connect with something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And Greene doesn't just stop at inspirational stories. He gives us some very practical advice based on his own strategies for how to find that purpose. He talks about concentrating your energy,
Okay.
pushing against those limitations of the past, even embracing discomfort as a path to growth.
It's almost like he's saying, hey, life's going to throw you curveballs, but you have a choice in how you respond. And responding with purpose, that can make all the difference.
I think that's a great takeaway. And one of the most thought-provoking ideas he puts forward is that true purpose. It often comes from exploring those hidden parts of ourselves, those shadows we were talking about earlier. It's like by facing our darkness, we can actually find our light.
I love that. And it reminds us that sometimes those things we perceive as weaknesses, those can actually be our greatest strengths in disguise.
Exactly. And if we want to find our purpose, we've got to be willing to dig deep, confront those parts of ourselves that we might be afraid of.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another really fascinating part of the book, where Greene talks about gender dynamics. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, he's not talking about those rigid societal norms. He's talking about the masculine and feminine qualities that exist within each of us, regardless of our biological sex.
It's about recognizing that we all have both masculine and feminine energies within us, and that by embracing both sides, we can become more whole.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about what he says about those qualities.
Well, he argues that we all inherit those masculine and feminine traits, from genetics, our upbringing, probably a combination of both.
Okay.
But here's the thing. In our need to present like a consistent identity to the world, we often repress one side or the other.
Oh, I see.
We over-identify with either the masculine role or the feminine role that's expected of us.
So what's the downside of that? Why does it even matter?
Greene believes that when we repress those qualities, it comes at a cost, you know? We lose out on valuable dimensions of our character. Our thinking gets rigid, we become less flexible in our actions, and our relationships, especially with the opposite sex, they suffer.
Because we're not showing up as our full selves.
Exactly. Exactly. And Greene's message is that we need to become aware of those lost masculine or feminine traits within us and slowly, carefully reconnect with them.
So how do we even begin to do that? How do we tap into those hidden parts of ourselves?
He says it starts with observation, you know? Pay attention to how you react in different situations, what makes you feel uncomfortable, and it feels effortless. Notice the patterns in your relationships. Are you always drawn to a certain type of person? Do you tend to play a specific role?
So it's about becoming more self-aware.
Yes, but it's also about active experimentation. You know, step outside your comfort zone. If you're always the assertive one, try being more receptive. If you tend to be more emotional, challenge yourself to approach a situation with logic.
It's like finding that balance between, like, the head and the heart.
Exactly. And by embracing both our masculine and feminine sides, we become more well-rounded individuals.
And that, in turn, makes us more adaptable, more resilient, and ultimately more successful in navigating, all the complexities of human nature.
Absolutely.
And speaking of navigating complexity, Greene doesn't shy away from one of the most primal and often misunderstood aspects of human behavior: aggression.
It's a fascinating topic for sure.
What does he say about aggression?
Well, he starts by acknowledging that on the surface, most people seem polite, civilized, right?
Right.
But underneath that mask, we're all dealing with these frustrations, a need to influence others, a desire to have some control over our circumstances.
Yeah.
And when we feel blocked in those endeavors, that's when aggression can rear its head.
So it's like a natural response to feeling thwarted or powerless.
In a way, yes. But Greene is careful to distinguish between, healthy assertiveness and what he calls chronic aggression.
Mm.
He points out that some people, they have a much greater need for power and they're far less patient in getting it. And those are the types that can become truly dangerous.
Right.
They resort to intimidation, manipulation, even outright cruelty to get what they want.
Okay, so how do we protect ourselves from those kinds of aggressors?
Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
The first step is to become a really keen observer of people's behavior. Pay attention to those subtle signs of aggression, not just the obvious outbursts,
Right.
but those more insidious forms of manipulation.
So what are some, red flags to look out for?
Greene says, pay attention to patterns. Has this person shown aggression in the past? Do they have a history of blaming others, refusing to take responsibility for their actions? Are they obsessed with controlling their environment, the people around them?
Okay.
These are all clues that someone might have a deeper aggression problem.
Okay, and once we've, identified those types,
Right?
how do we deal with them? Because we can't always avoid them, right?
You're right. Sometimes confrontation is unavoidable, but the key is to not let them get to you emotionally, because that's what they feed on.
Yeah.
Your fear, your anger, they want to rattle you so you can't think straight.
So it's like a mental game of chess.
Exactly. And to win that game, you got to stay calm, collected, one step ahead. Greene offers a few different strategies for dealing with aggressors, but one of the most effective he calls fighting dirty.
Ooh, fighting dirty. I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
No, he's not advocating violence or anything unethical, but he's saying sometimes you need to use unconventional tactics to defend yourself. Think of it like mental jujitsu.
So how does that work in practice, this fighting dirty?
It's about understanding your aggressor's weaknesses and using them against them. For example, if they're prone to arrogance, you might use flattery to kind of disarm them, make them think you're on their side while secretly working against their agenda.
Ooh, sneaky.
Or, if they have a reputation for being impulsive, you might provoke them into making a rash decision that ultimately backfires.
That's so clever. It's like you're using their own aggression against them.
Exactly. And remember, this is about self-preservation.
Right.
When the stakes are high, sometimes you got to fight fire with fire.
Or in this case, aggression with, a calculated counterattack.
Right.
I love that Greene doesn't shy away from these, more Machiavellian aspects of human nature.
It's refreshing.
It is. And, this leads us to another important theme in the book, the dynamics of group behavior.
We often like to think that we're independent thinkers, but Greene really emphasizes how much our behavior shifts when we're part of a group.
Yeah, we touched on that a bit earlier with that example of the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
Mhm.
But let's dig into that a little deeper. What are some of the ways groups influence our behavior?
Well, I think first we have to acknowledge that our brains are wired for social connection.
Right.
We're incredibly sensitive to the moods and the opinions of those around us. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Well,
It's what allows us to cooperate, to empathize, to build community.
right, right.
But there's a flip side, of course.
There always is.
Greene uses this analogy of a pack of animals
Okay.
to illustrate how groups can function in this primal, almost instinctive way.
Right.
When we're part of a group, we unconsciously imitate the behavior of others.
We do.
We're more likely to conform to those prevailing opinions even if we privately disagree.
Yeah.
And our emotions, they can become amplified,
Yeah.
leading to a kind of collective energy that can be incredibly powerful.
It can be intoxicating almost, right?
Oh, it absolutely can.
And, he also talks about the concept of court dynamics,
Mm.
which, as we mentioned earlier, isn't just about those literal royal courts, but any kind of hierarchical group.
Right, those dynamics are everywhere.
And what's so fascinating about those dynamics, to me, is that they reveal the kind of often hidden power plays that shape how we interact.
Mm.
Like we all want to gain influence to be in the good graces of those in power.
Of course.
And we often resort to, flattery, strategic alliances, even subtle forms of manipulation to try and get there.
Absolutely. And Greene uses a great example. He talks about Alexander Haig, who was an assistant to Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration.
Oh, interesting.
Now, Haig didn't have the same academic credentials as some of the other members of Kissinger's inner circle,
Okay.
but he was a master of understanding Kissinger's needs, Kissinger's desires.
I see.
He became indispensable by taking care of all the details, managing Kissinger's schedule, even, helping him get dressed for important events. He endured Kissinger's famous temper tantrums. He never challenged Kissinger's authority.
Right.
But behind that facade of loyalty, Haig was playing a much deeper game. He was subtly ingratiating himself with Nixon, the true power behind the throne.
Oh, wow. So it's like with court dynamics, it's not always clear who's pulling the strings.
Right, there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
And that's why it's so important to develop our powers of observation, right?
Absolutely.
Pay attention to the nonverbal cues, the subtle shifts in power, the alliances that form and dissolve.
The more we understand those dynamics, the better equipped we are to navigate them effectively.
It's almost like becoming, a social anthropologist.
It is. It is. But it's not just about observing others. It's also about becoming aware of how those group dynamics are influencing our own behavior. Because let's face it, we're all susceptible to those forces, whether we realize it or not. And Greene, actually, he gives us this powerful exercise for developing that self-awareness. He suggests asking yourself a series of questions. How have my ideas and beliefs changed since I've been part of this group? Do I hold back my true opinions to avoid conflict?
Ooh, good question.
Do I find myself agreeing with things that I don't actually believe in? Do I feel pressure to conform to the group's norms,
Right, yeah.
even if it goes against my own values?
Those are tough questions.
They are tough questions.
But I think the answers can be really revealing.
Absolutely. And once we understand how groups influence us, then we can start to make more conscious choices about how we participate. We can choose to conform when it serves our purpose.
Right.
But we can also choose to assert our individuality when it really matters.
It's like finding that balance between fitting in and standing out.
Exactly. And that leads us to another crucial aspect of navigating group dynamics, understanding the nature of authority.
Oh, okay. Authority. That's a topic I've always been fascinated by. What does Greene have to say about that?
Well, he starts by acknowledging that as humans, we have this natural tendency to both crave authority and resent it.
Oh, I see. It's like a push and pull.
It is. It is. We want strong leaders, people who can guide us and make those tough decisions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we bristle at being told what to do. It's a paradox that's just woven into our social fabric.
It is. And how does that paradox play out in our lives?
It shows up in our relationships with our bosses, our mentors, even our parents.
Yeah.
We might admire those in authority, but we also secretly envy them.
Right.
We want their power, but we also fear it. And that ambivalence can create a lot of tension, a lot of conflict.
For sure. So how do we reconcile that conflict within ourselves?
Greene argues that the first step is to understand the true nature of authority. He emphasizes that it's not about dominance,
Okay.
it's not about control, but rather about vision, competence, and trust. True authority, it's earned. It's not imposed. It comes from demonstrating that you have the best interests of the group at heart.
He gives a really good example. He talks about Xenophon, who was an Athenian general,
Oh, yes, Xenophon.
who led this group of Greek soldiers out of Persia after this disastrous military campaign.
It's an incredible story of leadership.
It is. And what's so remarkable about Xenophon is that he didn't actually have any prior military experience.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but in the midst of all that chaos and uncertainty, he was able to maintain his composure.
Wow.
He developed a really clear strategy and inspired those soldiers to follow him to safety.
It's like he stepped into the role that was needed,
He did.
even though he didn't have the formal title or the experience.
Exactly, and that's Greene's point. True authority, it comes from demonstrating your ability to solve problems.
Right.
Make those tough calls. Inspire confidence in those around you. So how do we cultivate that kind of authority in our own lives?
Well, it starts with setting high standards for yourself.
Okay.
Strive for excellence in your work, no matter what you do.
Yeah. Develop a reputation for competence and reliability. Be willing to take on challenges and see them through to completion.
So it's not about seeking power for its own sake. It's about demonstrating that you're worthy of being followed.
Precisely. And this leads to another crucial aspect of authority, the ability to stir conflicting emotions in those around you. Greene calls this cultivating an aura.
An aura. Okay, tell me more about that.
Most people are pretty predictable, you know? They present this consistent persona to the world. They're always jovial, always serious, or always trying to please.
Right, right.
But true authority figures, they're more complex.
They are?
They send mixed signals. They're not afraid to show their vulnerability.
Yeah.
But they also have a steeliness that commands respect.
So it's about being a bit unpredictable, keeping people guessing.
In a way, yes, but it's not about being manipulative.
Right.
It's about being authentically yourself with all your complexities and contradictions.
Yeah. Because that's what makes you interesting. That's what makes you memorable. And ultimately, that's what makes you influential.
It's like the old saying, keep 'em guessing.
Exactly. But there's actually a deeper psychological principle at play here.
Okay.
When we encounter someone who's a bit enigmatic, our brains become more engaged.
Interesting.
We want to figure them out, understand what makes them tick.
Right.
And that process of mental engagement, it actually strengthens their authority.
So it's like you're creating this puzzle that people can't resist trying to solve.
Precisely. And the more they think about you, the more your presence grows in their minds. You become larger than life, and that in turn enhances your authority.
I love how Greene blends, psychology and strategy in such a compelling way.
It's what makes his work so valuable. He's not just giving us these theoretical insights. He's giving us practical tools for navigating the complexities of human nature.
And speaking of practical tools, he offers some fascinating insights into how to build a really solid reputation and cultivate lasting influence.
Absolutely. One of the most important principles he emphasizes is the need to develop what he calls strategic generosity.
Okay, strategic generosity. Tell me more about that. What does that look like in practice?
Well, it starts with understanding that true generosity, it's not about giving things away indiscriminately. It's about using your resources wisely
Okay.
to create a network of allies, of supporters.
So it's like investing in relationships.
Exactly. But it's not just about giving people what they want.
No.
It's about anticipating their needs, surprising them with gestures that go above and beyond.
Okay.
He gives this great example of Benjamin Franklin,
Oh, Ben Franklin.
who was a master of strategic generosity.
Okay.
He understood that the key to building influence was to make people feel indebted to him.
Interesting.
But he didn't do this by showering them with, extravagant gifts or favors. He did it by offering his time, his expertise, his connections.
I see.
For example, when a rival printer was struggling to get his business off the ground, Franklin offered to print some pamphlets for him at a discounted rate.
So it wasn't a huge financial sacrifice for Franklin,
No, not at all.
but it made a big impact on the other printer.
It did. And as a result, that printer became one of Franklin's most loyal allies. He felt indebted to Franklin and was always willing to return the favor. That's the power of strategic generosity.
It's like planting those seeds that will grow into this network of support.
Exactly. And the more you cultivate those relationships, the more influence you will have in the long run.
So it's not just about what you give, it's how you give it.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important aspect of building a strong reputation, which is the ability to recognize and manage people's envy.
Ooh, envy. That's such a tricky emotion, right?
It is.
It can be so disguised as other things.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Greene argues that envy is one of the most primal, destructive human emotions.
Uh-huh.
It stems from our deep-seated need to feel superior to others.
Okay.
And when we encounter someone who seems to have something we want, whether it's success, talent, beauty, even just a happy relationship, our envy can get triggered.
Oh, yeah. It's like we're comparing ourselves to others and coming up short in our own minds.
And it's often unconscious.
It is.
We're not even aware that it's happening.
So what are some signs that someone might be envious of us?
Greene offers a few clues to look out for. For example, envious people, they often give backhanded
Oh,
compliments.
those are the worst.
They are. They might praise your work, but in a way that kind of diminishes your accomplishments.
Yeah, yeah.
Or they might express concern for your well-being while secretly hoping for your downfall.
Oh, wow, that's harsh.
It is, it is.
So it's like they're trying to sabotage you without seeming overtly hostile.
Exactly. And that's what makes envy so insidious, you know? It often operates beneath the surface, disguised as politeness or concern.
So how do we protect ourselves from those envious types?
Well, the first thing to remember is that we can't control other people's emotions.
Right.
Some people are simply predisposed to envy. There's nothing we can do about that.
Right, so it's not our fault if someone's envious of us.
Right. It's their issue to deal with, not ours. However, we can control how we respond to that envy. And Greene offers a few valuable strategies for doing just that.
Like what? What are some things we can do?
Well, one of the most effective tactics is to downplay your successes, you know?
Oh, okay.
Don't brag or boast about your accomplishments.
Right.
Instead, express gratitude for your good fortune and acknowledge the role that others have played in your success.
So it's like you're taking the wind out of their sails a little bit.
Exactly. By kind of minimizing your achievements, you're less likely to trigger that envy.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those people who are just chronically envious? Like those people who are constantly trying to tear others down.
Greene's advice is to avoid those types as much as possible. Their negativity is contagious, and it's just not worth the energy to engage with them.
Right.
Now, if you can't avoid them altogether, at least try to limit your interactions.
Okay.
And definitely don't share any personal information with them.
So it's like protecting yourself from a toxic substance almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's what chronic envy is. It's a poison that can eat away at your confidence, at your happiness.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important to remember that we have the power to choose who we allow into our lives.
We do. We absolutely do. And that leads us to another really critical aspect of navigating human nature, and that's understanding the fickleness of those around us.
Okay, I'm curious to hear what Greene has to say about that.
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, people can be so unpredictable.
They can. They can. And Greene argues that fickleness, it's rooted in our deep-seated need for, novelty and excitement. We get bored easily. We're always looking for that next big thing.
Oh, yeah.
And this applies to our relationships, our careers, even our political beliefs.
Oh, that's a good point.
We're quick to embrace new ideas and trends, but we're just as quick to abandon them when something more appealing comes along.
It's like we're always chasing those butterflies,
Yeah.
flitting from one thing to the next.
Exactly, exactly. And he uses a really interesting example. He talks about King Louis XVI, who was overthrown during the French Revolution.
Oh, yes.
Now, Louis was considered to be a decent man, but he was also very indecisive, out of touch with the changing mood of his people,
Right.
and it ultimately cost him his throne.
Yeah, wow. So what's the lesson there? How do we deal with that fickleness in others, especially if we're trying to build trust and influence?
Well, Greene emphasizes that we should never take loyalty for granted.
Yep.
We have to constantly demonstrate that we're worthy of that trust,
So it's almost like we're constantly auditioning for that role of leaders in people's lives.
In a way, yes. And it means being reliable, competent, and truly having their best interests at heart.
Right, right.
But we can't just sit back and wait for people to come to us, Greene also talks about the importance of staying ahead of the curve.
Oh, okay.
He emphasizes that we need to be constantly learning, adapting to the changing times. If we're stuck in our ways, we'll quickly become irrelevant.
Yeah, it's like we need to be the ones driving the change, not being dragged along by it.
Exactly. And that means, being open to new ideas, challenging our own assumptions.
Right.
Always seeking ways to improve.
Otherwise, it's like we're standing still while the world is moving on without us.
Right. Exactly. And all of this, the self-awareness, the understanding of human nature, it leads to one of the most powerful ideas in the book: finding your true purpose in life.
And I think that's something that so many people struggle with.
They do. And Greene makes this really clear distinction between real purpose and false purpose.
Okay. I'm really curious to hear more about that. What did he say about finding that real purpose?
Well, he argues that real purpose, it comes from deep within. It's a passion, a calling, a sense of mission that just drives you forward.
Okay.
It's not about external validation.
Right.
It's not about achieving some arbitrary goal. It's about connecting with something bigger than yourself.
I love that. It's like finding that unique place in the universe where you fit in
Yeah.
and you can make a real contribution.
And Greene argues that this is what gives our lives true meaning.
Right.
On the other hand, he says, false purpose, that's often about seeking external validation.
Okay.
It's about chasing after money, fame, power, even if those things don't align with your values.
Yeah.
It's about trying to impress others instead of expressing your authentic self.
And I imagine that leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, right?
Right.
Like you might achieve all the outward markers of success, but still feel empty inside.
Exactly, exactly. And he uses the example of Michael Eisner again.
Okay, yeah.
Who built this massive empire with Disney, but seemed to lose sight of what truly mattered to him along the way.
Yeah.
It's like he achieved the American dream, but sacrificed his own happiness in the process.
Wow. That's a powerful lesson. So if we want to avoid that trap, how do we go about finding that real purpose? I'm guessing it's not as simple as just like making a list of goals.
Greene suggests looking back at your childhood passions.
Okay.
He believes that those early interests, they're often clues to your true calling.
Okay.
They represent those things that you were naturally drawn to, before the world started telling you what you should be interested in.
That's so interesting. It's like going back to that time when you were just genuinely curious about the world before all the pressures of like adulting set in.
Exactly, exactly. Think about what fascinated you as a child. What could you spend hours doing without getting bored? It's like a treasure map leading back to your authentic self.
I love that. And once we've like rediscovered those passions, then what?
It's about finding ways to integrate them into your adult life.
Okay.
Maybe it means switching careers, starting a creative project, or simply making more time for those things that bring you joy.
Yeah.
The key is aligning your actions with your values, so you're living a life that feels truly meaningful.
It sounds like it's about creating a life where work doesn't feel like work.
Exactly.
Because it's aligned with what truly matters to you.
And speaking of things that matter, Greene doesn't shy away from exploring one of life's biggest mysteries, which is death.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He actually believes that contemplating our own mortality can be incredibly empowering.
I'm not sure I follow that. How can thinking about death be empowering?
Well, he argues that facing our mortality forces us to confront what's truly important.
Okay.
We start prioritizing relationships, passions, those things that bring us joy. We shift away from those more superficial concerns.
Right.
And we start to focus on living a life of purpose.
I see. Yeah. It's like a wake-up call, reminding us that our time is precious. We shouldn't waste it on things that don't really matter.
Exactly. And one of the things that Greene highlights is that often our greatest potential is actually hidden in those parts of ourselves that we tend to shy away from, those shadow aspects we were talking about earlier.
It's like the idea that our perceived weaknesses can actually be our greatest strengths in disguise.
Exactly. And to uncover those strengths, we need to be willing to explore our shadows.
Okay.
Confront our fears and embrace the fullness of who we are.
That's a really powerful message. It's like a reminder that personal growth often involves embracing discomfort.
It does.
Facing those things that we'd rather avoid.
And this leads to another really crucial aspect of understanding ourselves, and that is the stories that we tell ourselves.
Okay.
Greene points out that we're constantly creating these narratives about our lives, but these narratives aren't always accurate or even helpful.
Right. You mean like those inner voices that can sometimes be our own worst critics.
Exactly. And Greene argues that those negative stories can actually hold us back from reaching our full potential. He calls this self-sabotage.
So how do we break free from those self-sabotaging stories?
It starts with becoming aware of the narratives that we're telling ourselves.
Yeah.
Pay attention to your thoughts.
Right.
And ask yourself, is this story actually true? Is it serving me? Or is it limiting me?
So it's like becoming the editor of our own mental movie.
Exactly. And once we've identified those negative narratives, we can start to challenge them.
Okay.
Question their validity, look for evidence that contradicts them.
Right.
And most importantly, start rewriting them with more positive, more empowering stories.
I love that idea. It's about taking control of our inner dialogue.
Yes.
And choosing to focus on stories that uplift and inspire us, rather than those that hold us back.
And speaking of inspiration, one of the things that makes Greene's work so compelling is that he doesn't just point out the problems, he actually offers solutions.
Right, right.
He gives us very concrete strategies for understanding and navigating the complexities of human nature.
It's like he's giving us a toolbox filled with, practical tips and techniques that we can use to improve our lives.
And one of the most important tools he offers is the concept of strategic empathy.
Okay, strategic empathy. What is that?
It's about understanding the emotions and the motivations of others, not just on an intellectual level, but on a deeper, more visceral level.
Okay,
It's about putting yourself in their shoes
right.
and seeing the world from their perspective.
So it's like that old saying, walk a mile in someone else's moccasins before you judge them.
Exactly. But Greene, he takes it a step further. He argues that strategic empathy, it's not just about being compassionate, it's about using that understanding to influence and persuade others.
That's interesting. So it's not just about feeling empathy, it's about using it strategically to achieve your goals.
Precisely. And he gives some really fascinating examples of how this works in practice.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, he talks about how Abraham Lincoln was a master of strategic empathy.
Oh,
Lincoln was known for his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, even those who disagreed with him.
yeah.
He would listen patiently to their concerns and try to understand their point of view, even if he didn't agree with it.
That's a great example. It's like he was able to disarm his opponents by showing them that he genuinely cared about their perspective.
And by doing so, he was able to build trust and influence people in a way that few other leaders have been able to match.
It's like a reminder that sometimes the best way to win an argument is to not argue at all.
Exactly, exactly. And this brings us back to one of those core themes that we've been discussing throughout this entire deep dive, which is the importance of self-awareness.
Yeah.
The more we understand ourselves, our strengths, our weaknesses, our tendencies, the better equipped we are to navigate all the complexities of human nature.
And the more we understand others, the more effectively we can connect with them, influence them, and build those meaningful relationships.
Precisely. And that's ultimately what Greene's work is all about, helping us to become more effective, more fulfilled human beings.
Will said. Well, that feels like a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Indeed, indeed. We've covered a lot of ground today. I hope our listeners are finding these insights as thought-provoking as we are.
There's so much to unpack with this book. It really gets you thinking.
Yeah, there really is.
One of the things that I keep coming back to from our last conversation was the idea of those life scripts
Right.
that we develop,
Early on.
early on,
Mm-hmm.
and how those unconscious patterns can really play out in our lives.
Oh, they really do. And one of the most common ways those scripts manifest is through self-sabotage.
Oh, yeah.
We create those narratives in our heads that limit our potential,
Yeah.
and often we're not even aware of it.
So how do we even become aware of those self-sabotaging stories?
Yeah.
Because if they're unconscious, it seems like they'd be hard to spot.
It starts with just paying attention to your inner dialogue.
Yeah.
Notice those recurring thoughts and beliefs, especially the ones that make you feel anxious, discouraged.
Yeah.
Ask yourself if those stories are actually true or if they're just old tapes playing on repeat.
It's like becoming aware of the soundtrack that's playing in the background of our lives.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
And recognizing which songs are empowering and which ones are holding us back.
Exactly. And once you've identified those negative narratives, then you can start to challenge them,
Okay.
question their validity, look for evidence that contradicts them, and most importantly, start rewriting them with more positive, more empowering stories.
So it's not just about silencing that inner critic.
No.
It's about replacing that voice with a more supportive, encouraging one.
Exactly. It's about becoming the author of your own story, rather than letting those old scripts dictate your life.
And, speaking of stories, Greene also talks about the importance of understanding how other people perceive us.
Oh, yes.
He uses this term, the spectacle, to describe the image we project to the world.
He emphasizes that in a world that's full of distractions, it's so crucial to create a compelling persona,
Right.
one that people will remember. And this isn't about being fake or putting on an act. It's about understanding the power of presentation
Okay.
and using it strategically to achieve your goals.
So it's like we're all performers on the stage of life.
In a sense, yes. And like any good performer, we need to be aware of our audience, our message, the impact that we want to create.
But how do we do that in a way that feels authentic?
Yeah.
I don't want to feel like I'm constantly putting on a mask.
The key is to align your outer persona with your inner values and aspirations. you know?
Okay.
It's about finding ways to express your authentic self in a way that resonates with others and that helps you achieve your goals.
So it's about being strategic, but not sacrificing our integrity.
Right. And one of the best ways to create a compelling spectacle is by cultivating a sense of mystery.
Oh, I love that. It's like the idea that a little bit of intrigue can go a long way.
Exactly. Greene points out that people are naturally drawn to what they don't fully understand.
Okay.
When we create an aura of mystery, we pique their curiosity. We make them want to learn more about us.
It's like that saying, familiarity breeds contempt.
Right.
Sometimes a little bit of distance can actually make us more attractive and more influential.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to the importance of strategic empathy.
Okay.
The more we understand those desires, the motivations of others, the better equipped we are to create a spectacle that resonates with them.
And, speaking of understanding others, one of the most challenging aspects of human nature, I think, is dealing with difficult people.
Oh, it is. It is.
We've all encountered those individuals who just seem determined to make our lives miserable.
It's true, and Greene offers some really valuable insights into how to handle these challenging personalities. He emphasizes that the first step is to understand that these people are often driven by their own insecurities and frustrations.
So it's not really about us.
Exactly. Their behavior is a reflection of their own inner turmoil, not a personal attack on you.
Okay.
And once you understand that, it becomes a lot easier to detach emotionally and respond in a way that protects your own well-being.
So it's about not taking their behavior personally
Right.
and recognizing that they're probably fighting their own battles.
And sometimes the best way to deal with a difficult person is to simply avoid them.
Oh, I love that. Sometimes the most strategic move is to just walk away.
Exactly.
Right.
But if avoidance isn't possible, Greene suggests using a technique that he calls the strategic retreat.
Okay.
This involves temporarily disengaging from the situation to give yourself time to kind of regroup and devise a more effective strategy.
It's like taking a time out
Yes.
to calm down and strategize your next move.
And once you've had a chance to regain your composure, then you can re-engage from a position of strength and clarity.
That's brilliant advice.
It is.
It's so easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment
Oh, it is.
and react impulsively. But taking that strategic pause can make all the difference.
It can, and it reminds us that we always have a choice in how we respond to those challenging situations.
And that brings us back to one of the most empowering messages in Greene's work, which is, we're not victims of circumstance.
Right.
We have the power to choose our thoughts, our beliefs, and our actions.
And by understanding the laws of human nature, we can harness that power to create a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible. We've explored the depths of human nature, uncovered hidden patterns, learned some really practical strategies for navigating, the ups and downs of life. I feel like I've been given like a secret decoder ring for understanding myself and others better.
Oh, me too. It's been a real pleasure sharing these insights with you.
Absolutely.
And I hope our listeners have found this deep dive into Robert Greene's The Laws of Human Nature as enlightening and empowering as we have.
I hope so too.
Remember, understanding human nature is a lifelong pursuit. But even small steps toward greater self-awareness, those can make a profound difference in your life.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone, and happy decoding.